In this video for publishers, we'll look at how to use learning objectives and how they behave differently from other question information. You can tag questions with question information such as difficulty levels and topics. You can use question information to filter questions and build assessments. Question information can also be used to sort questions in question sets and tests. Finally, learning objectives and other standards can be used in a variety of reports. Let's start by looking at some basic question information. I'm going to click the pencil icon next to a question. Then I'll click Edit Info to open the question information dialog. Notice that difficulty and reference each have a single field where you can enter any text you like. Standards are a special kind of question information and include things like accrediting standards, national standards, state standards, and learning objectives. What makes standards different from other question information is that standards have an ID and a description. Things like difficulty levels and references are usually a word or two, so it's not a big concern to type them. Standards and learning objectives tend to be longer and would be more work to type in. With standards and objectives, it's easier to be able to enter an ID rather than the complete text of the standard or objective. Here is a sample of some math standards from Ohio. Notice that there is a standard number and a description of what the standard is. Here is a sample of a national standard in the question information dialog. Notice that it also has an ID and a description of the standard. Learning objectives also have an ID and description. The text of learning objectives and standards are stored at the database level. This allows you to share standards and objectives across products while ensuring that the wording of the standards remains consistent wherever they're used. Once a learning objective is in the system, all you have to do is tag the question with the learning objective ID, and the description is automatically added. This saves you from typing the description every time. Since learning objectives and other standards can be shared across products, the IDs need to be unique. To ensure that the IDs are unique, it's helpful to create a numbering convention for the IDs. If we look at the Ohio Math Standards again, we can see an example of how you could create user-friendly IDs. These IDs are made up of three components: the grade level, the math topic, and the learning objective number. So 7.G.5 is a learning objective for 7th grade geometry. It's the 5th, 7th grade learning objective. While this numbering system is clear, it may be too simple to ensure a unique ID if you were creating a lot of learning objectives. Some publishers like to use information about the product to create their learning objective IDs. For example, you could create IDs that contain the author's name, the product title, the edition, the chapter, and the learning objective number. For example, we have a product that is Jane Smith's Geometry 15th edition. The learning objective ID is made up of the first 4 letters of the author's name, a 4-letter abbreviation of the title, a 2-digit edition number, a 2-digit chapter number, and a learning objective number. So in this example, calculate the perimeter of a square is the first learning objective in Chapter 1 of the 15th edition of Smith's Geometry. This numbering convention is nice because it makes it clear to instructors how the learning objectives relate to the book. The drawback is that because the edition number is in the ID, you will have to create a new set of learning objectives every time you release a new edition of the book. It's easy to do a batch replacement of learning objectives. However, if you plan to have the edition number or a release year in your learning objective ID, you just need to plan on swapping out learning objectives as part of the content development process. Another way to approach learning objective IDs is to create a set of objectives that are shared across a discipline. For example, if you have several geometry products, they will all probably have a learning objective that has to do with calculating the perimeter of a square. There's no reason to create product-specific IDs for those learning objectives. In this example, the learning objective ID is made up of an abbreviation for the discipline, followed by an abbreviation for a skill or topic within the discipline, and the learning objective number. So the discipline is geometry, the skill or topic is squares, and the learning objective number is 001. The benefits of this numbering system is that you can use it across multiple products, and you don't have to worry about making updates when new additions are created. You could also add components to the ID to create learning objectives that contribute to a larger learning objective. Here's an example from an English literature product. One of the big learning objectives is poetry. Within poetry, I have learning objectives focused on formal and free verse poetry. So I've created a numbering scheme that will make the subtasks under the learning objectives clear. Once you come up with a numbering convention, you can import your learning objectives so they're available to tag questions. To import your learning objectives, create a spreadsheet with 2 columns. Label the columns so it's clear which column has the ID and which has the description. I simply labeled my columns ID and description. We'll see how those labels work in a minute. Then enter the ID and description for each learning objective and save the spreadsheet as a CSV file. To import the learning objectives, right-click any folder or container in the question sets or tests pane. Then click Import Global Standards. By default, the learning objectives option is selected in the Type dropdown. If you are importing another type of standard, you can select it from the list. Then click Choose File. Depending on the browser you're using, this button may be called Browse. Then select the CSV file you created and open it. Then click Upload. Next, we're going to map the columns in our spreadsheet to the fields in the database so the system can tell the difference between the ID and the description. CSV is selected by default in the Type dropdown. We put headings in our columns, so we want to make sure that File has headers is selected. You don't have to put headings on your columns. It just makes the next step of the process easier. Now we're going to map the columns in our spreadsheet to the corresponding columns in the database. The 4 columns to the right represent the content we're importing. The original name column contains the column heading from our spreadsheet. The data columns show examples of the data in the spreadsheet. We can see that the first row contains our IDs and that the second row contains the descriptions. The first column in this dialog box lets us select the column from the database that matches our spreadsheet. Let's click the drop-down for the first row. Our choices are Standard ID and Standard Description. Since the first row contains our IDs, let's select Standard ID. In the second row, we'll select Standard Description from the drop-down. Now that we have our columns matched up, we'll click Import. We'll receive a message that our objectives were imported successfully, so we'll click OK, and then click Done. Now that we've imported our learning objectives, we can tag questions with them. I'll start by selecting Edit Info from the pencil menu. In the Question Information dialog, I'll click Add Record in the Learning Objectives section. Next, I'll type the objective ID and press Tab. Notice that when we tab to the next field, the learning objective description automatically populates. So instead of typing the description over and over, we just need to enter the ID. Authors can use the spreadsheet you uploaded as reference and copy and paste IDs to tag questions. One important caution: if you tag a question with the wrong learning objective, click the Delete link to delete the incorrect objective. Then click Add Record to add the correct learning objective. Don't edit the text of the learning objective. Because learning objectives are stored at the database level, if you change the text of the objective on one question, that will affect the description on all the questions that are tagged with that learning objective ID. Here is our question with the learning objective added. You can see the ID in the description. And that's an overview of using learning objectives. We've just looked at the basics. There are many other ways to add learning objectives, including doing them in a batch. Check the help for additional information.